now present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. This Tuesday is Wisconsin's spring election. Now, every 4 years, that also coincides with the presidential primary. Though this time around, there won't be much to vote for. Current and former presidents Biden and Trump are set for a rematch of the 2020 election. But that doesn't diminish the importance of these down-ballot races that Wisconsinites will still get to vote for, including local county races, school referenda, and 2 constitutional amendments. Now, they deal with bans on outside money and outside contractors working in Wisconsin elections. Joining us to get a better sense of what these amendments mean is constitutional expert Howard Schwaber. I want to first get a sense of how we got here. So in Wisconsin, a constitutional amendment has to pass 2 different sessions of the state legislature and then be approved by a statewide referendum vote. Is that normal for how other states amend their constitutions?
Wisconsin is one of the more difficult processes. The 2 sessions requirement is, by definition, extends the time. It has to succeed over an extended period of time. A lot of states will adopt constitutional amendments straightforwardly by referendum. Some have combined legislative and referendum action, but yes, Wisconsin is unusual for making it quite this difficult to amend the Constitution.
Now, this election in Wisconsin, there's nothing to vote for at the presidential level. Do voters still engage with those constitutional amendment and referenda in the same way? Will there be lower turnout, for example?
So there are several things at work here. There is an assumption, which has been true historically, that low turnout elections favor Republicans, particularly in Wisconsin. Off-year elections that are not, that is, votes on a referendum question that are not at the same time as a presidential primary or a major election get low turnout. So there is a strategic calculation here that these referendum measures are more likely to pass because they're being put out at a time when turnout is likely to be very low.
So we also have the connotation that these Republican-authored amendments could drive conservative turnout. Do you think we'll see that for this election?
Well, I'm sure there'll be an effort to paint the issue that way. So we really need to turn to the substance of these amendments. These amendments are based on 2 assumptions, both of which are interesting and extremely cynical. First, that Republicans cannot win elections by persuading voters. That is, Republicans can win elections only by ensuring that Republican voters' voices are heard and Democratic voters' voices are heard less. So it's about geography. So the assumption is that Milwaukee votes Democratic and will always vote Democratic, and therefore, if a Republican candidate wants to succeed in a statewide election, they need to diminish the clout of Milwaukee, and you can extend that model across any number of other places. So the second thing is that the way to do that, or one way to do that, that is one way to diminish the clout of Democratic-leaning areas, right, as opposed to voters specifically, is to starve them of resources. So there's a long-standing pattern going back 10 years of ever since 2010, when Republicans took control of a great number of state legislatures across the country in the big red wave election, there have been an enormous number of things like poll closings, carefully targeted in Democratic areas, or rather urban and minority areas, which are presumed to be likely to vote Democratic. These are what are sometimes called second-generation barriers to voting. It's a form of voter suppression that does not, according to the Supreme Court, violate the Constitution. And they've been core. That and gerrymandering have been the 2 cores to Republican success in Wisconsin for many years. As we know, the gerrymander is no longer in place. And for the first time in a long time, there will be competitive elections coming in the fall. Now the Republicans' fear is that there will be high turnout and high effective voting by voters in Democratic areas. We have seen over and over pictures of people standing in line for 8 hours to vote in Milwaukee. And the reason is that the state has starved Milwaukee of the resources that it would need to conduct elections. It's important to recognize this is not a referendum about the use of money to influence the outcome of elections by supporting candidates or promoting messages or buying airtime. On all of those kinds of areas, in fact, for the last 20 years, the Republicans have been the one pushing to open the floodgates and allow outside funding and private funding to come into the election. This is funding simply to get people to have the resources to cast votes at all. And I don't have a non-cynical explanation for why someone would want to do that, except that they're fearful that if all the voters were able to cast their votes, the Republicans would lose.
Yeah, do you think we'll see these amendments pass at all? Will these restrictions end up being put in place?
Well, I mean, so it's part of a larger strategy. So it's entirely possible that this will pass, at least at the referendum voting stage, because turnout in this referendum is likely to be at 20% or lower. Of course, if it happens that the Democrats take a majority of the legislature in the next electoral cycle, they can vote to allocate sufficient state resources to have enough polling places for everyone. Right. So I mean, there are many ways in which this fight can be had. This is one skirmish in an overall strategic campaign for advantage. In this particular instance, this is one of several ways in which the Republicans in Wisconsin are trying to dilute the effectiveness of Democratic votes in order to secure victory. It goes with gerrymandering, it goes with other forms of voter suppression, and of course, the Democrats are trying to push the other way. I mean, we should be clear. This is entirely a fight for partisan advantage, and certainly there should be no assumption that only one party is capable of these kind of actions. But in the last 10 years, it has very much been the pattern in Wisconsin that it has been Republicans trying to use gerrymandering and voter suppression to keep their advantage. I might point out that in states like New York and Maryland, Democrats have been engaging in gerrymandering. So again, nationally, this is not a party-specific practice, but in Wisconsin, this is very specifically a Republican strategy to maintain their advantage in the legislature, despite losing the gerrymander, by now keeping onto this other advantage, the relative disenfranchisement of voters in democratically leaning areas by starving them of the resources they need to run elections. Private foundations like Mr. Zuckerberg's have stepped in to fill that gap. Imagine if this were a different resource. Imagine if private money were being used to supply drinking water the state was not providing. No one would imagine there's a legitimate reason for the state not to provide drinking water. Yet it is a sign of the cynicism of the times in which we live that there's a straight-faced argument that says it is legitimate for the state to deny people access to the ballot and somehow illegitimate for outside money to be used to secure them what ought to be a basic democratic right.
Do we see other states make similar restrictions? Is this kind of quote unquote normal?
Yes, there are more than 20 states are entertaining, all dominated by Republicans, are entertaining referenda or pieces of legislation of this kind. It is a national strategy, as gerrymandering was, to preserve the ability of essentially a minority party to maintain disproportionate majorities across a variety of states.
So how new in Wisconsin is this? I mean, we've seen this fight kind of over these outside grants start in 2020. How new are these?
It's relatively new, partly because the concerted effort to shut polling places and for example, there was the 2020 election in which a city in Kansas was reduced to one polling place, and that polling place was located far outside the city limits. The Brennan Center is a center in New York that keeps track of these things, and they have excellent maps showing closures of polling places since 2016, and it has become a national strategy. And that's only, of course, one part of it. Think of the laws, for example, that were passed prohibiting people from giving food and water to people standing in line to vote, right? That was another effort to first require what are presumed to be Democratic voters to stand in line for many hours, then make it difficult for them to, survive that experience. The effort is to make it as difficult as possible for Democratic voters to vote, while making it easy for Republican voters to vote, in the hope that this will, sway the outcome by having an unequal effect on turnout. The whole fight over turnout starts with the assumption, and to a large extent, this is true of both parties at present, that voters are not persuadable, right? Voters are going to vote one way or the other, and the only question is which voters will show up at the polls, as opposed to trying to persuade voters to vote for your party or your candidate as opposed to the other one. The general wisdom now is that 40% of the country at the national level is solidly for Trump and 40% is solidly for Biden, and no more than 20% is up for grabs. And given the way our elections work, it's much more effective, much more efficient to try and rig the game than to try and win by getting more people to vote for your candidate.
Yeah, and I guess too, what does the future look like for this in American politics?
Um, well, I think this is a sign of the dysfunction of American elections, which have really reached a level that is troubling in a very deep way in terms of the future of the democracy. There are positive signs on the horizon. There are signs that in some states, at least, people are getting tired of this. There are signs that some state courts are beginning to push back against more overt, for example, gerrymandering mechanisms, as has occurred in Wisconsin. But at the moment, it is very hard to avoid the conclusion that the American electoral system has become a scene of gamesmanship and manipulation rather than a scene of sort of democratic persuasion, as we all naively thought it was supposed to be when we all took our government classes in high school.
Howard Schwaber, thanks so much. Now, when we come back, we sit down with Will Flanders for more on what to expect from these constitutional amendments. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. With the two major constitutional amendments on the ballot next week, we turn now to Will Flanders with the conservative Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. And I want to start first to get a sense from you on what we're talking about when we talk about this outside money, the quote-unquote Zuckerbucks.
Yeah, so what we're talking about with Zuckerbucks is outside billionaires using money to fund election administration in Wisconsin. We saw this during the 2020 election with obviously Mark Zuckerberg contributing to the Center for Tech and Civic Life, CTCL, that funded election administration in a lot of municipalities throughout the state. Our research showed that it disproportionately benefited the Democratic Party. More money went to more Democratic-leaning areas. But I think no matter what side of the aisle someone is on, they should be concerned about the prospect of outside billionaires funding election administration in any part of the state.
So why do we need these in Wisconsin in terms of election security?
Yeah, so I think that, whether or not you think, Zuckerbucks were used in a nonpartisan way, what we've seen is that there's a danger that an outside billionaire could come in and fund elections completely without any lip service whatsoever to nonpartisanship, right? A NRA or an Elon Musk could come in and only fund election administration in conservative-leaning areas. We could see Zuckerberg do the same thing again, and maybe only exclusively for liberal areas. And there's nothing in the current state law that precludes that. So what we saw in 2020 was sort of this problem exposed, and these amendments are important because they take care of it and help restore people's faith in the election process.
So some of the 6 largest cities in Wisconsin got a good chunk of that money, but in all, more than 200 cities got grants. Does that give you any more assurance that this wasn't just targeting Democratic areas?
Yeah, I think that's certainly right. And, they say, and we take them at their word, that any municipality that requested money received funding. I will note that, when you look at the per voter, amounts of money, it was still more in some of the largest communities in the state than it was in the smaller ones. I think if you get to the very smallest cities, those $5,000 grants went a long way, but everywhere in between sort of received less money disproportionately than those big 5 cities that got the most overall funding.
So we heard earlier in the program from Howard Schwaber equating these funds to as if a nonprofit was stepping in to give city money to help supply clean water to its citizens. What do you make of that analogy?
Yeah, so I think the problem is the disproportionality, right? To follow on that example, it's not just one community that might be without water, right? It's the whole state. And here's a billionaire coming in to fund it just in one particular community, maybe. So, what we think is preferable, there's room to have a discussion about more public funding of elections. If there are municipalities that, really genuinely need additional funding. We did see cities like Oshkosh that didn't get any CTCL money, still a relatively large city, seem to have a decent election process and didn't seem to have any major issues. So, while we do question the extent to which more money is needed, I think it's absolutely fine to have that discussion. But the cure can't be worse than the disease, and we think that the prospect of private funding is a bigger problem. Maybe on the margins, needing to give a little extra public money to municipalities.
Now, do you think we'll see these amendments pass next week? Will they drive conservative turnout in this election?
Yeah, so what we've seen in polling is this is a pretty popular issue across partisan lines. I think people intuitively, outside of the sort of politically online, group that's really involved in, which side supports what issue. When folks intuitively see, should we have, private funding of elections, the intuitive reaction is no, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. So I think there's a good chance that these will pass. And I think it could be a good driver of turnout as well. In an election where there's not a race for either presidential, at the top of the ballot, this could be something absolutely that would drive a conservative turnout particularly.
Will Flanders, thanks so much for joining us. When we come back, we give you a behind-the-scenes look at how Wisconsin's political parties are preparing for this fall's election. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. We sat down with the key players in both of Wisconsin's major political parties for a Campaign 2024 election special earlier in the week. Now, as you might expect, there's a lot to get through, and we couldn't do it in that short of a time. So we have more for you this morning. We pick up with Democratic State Party Chair Ben Wickler, who chatted with News 8 in La Crosse.
What's so striking in this election is that whoever wins the most votes probably gets the majority of the state legislative seats. And in that world, voters can actually change things if they don't like the way things are going. And what you see from Western Wisconsin is candidates who really represent their communities, who have common sense, they get what people go through every day, and they want to fight to make their communities stronger and better and more free. Voters always look for a candidate who understands them and is on their side, and a candidate who will fight for them and actually make a difference and be effective. We have such great candidates, and the Democratic Party of Wisconsin is neutral in the primary. I know whichever way the voters go, they're going to have a champion who's ready to take on Derek Van Orden, who really fails on both counts. He hasn't gotten things done in the United States House. It's the least productive Congress in recent memory. And he's not aligned with most voters in this district who want someone who actually represents them and their values and isn't going to the January 6th insurrection and then siding with Trump every step of the way.
Back in Madison, our own Eric Franke sat down with Brandon Malley, the chair of the Dane County Republican Party. Here's more from that conversation.
Let's talk a little bit about your ground mobilization and how you're going to reach people. And, you've got a big Senate race, Eric Hovde challenging Tammy Baldwin. Obviously, we've touched on the presidential race as well. What does your ground effort look like here in Dane County?
So we're expanding our headquarters, we're expanding our fundraising operation to be able to have more boots on the ground. It's very important. I know the state party is bringing in some staffers. There are organizations out there like Turning Point that are bringing in staff on the ground to actively chase voters the way that the left does. The left has a lot of 501c4 organizations that come in and they mobilize voters. We need a little bit more of that on the Republican side, on the conservative side. From the county party perspective, we're just building a volunteer army. That's really what it's about. Raising money, volunteer army, bringing out speakers. Not everybody wants to come out to Dane County, but if we don't want to be the death knell in the Senate majority and in the presidency, we're going to need to bring out the heavy hitters, and we're going to need to bring them to the outskirts of Madison so that our Republican voters feel energized. All about energizing our voters in the next 8 months.
How do you build the future of the Republican Party in this state and in Dane County? We're in a college town, so you tend to see that, you see a more liberal presence, a progressive presence in college towns. How do you build it here in Dane County? How do you build it in the state? You guys have lost some key people. I mean, Mike Gallagher leaving is a huge loss. That was a rising star in your party. Paul Ryan was that 15 years ago. He's off to the sidelines now. How do you build a strong future for the Republican Party in Wisconsin?
Well, I think we've got a great candidate coming up in the ranks with Eric Hovde. He's running a good campaign. He's doing a really good job with digital right now, and he's all over the state, on message, all about restoring the American dream. And I think that message will resonate with a lot of people that are not traditionally Republican either. Now, with President Trump, it's a whole different ballgame, but with Hovde, restoring the American dream should resonate with everybody. There are blue dog Democrats that go back to the Kennedy and Reagan era, and they like that message. They do, and they think that the left has gone a little bit too far. Now, for us to build a permanent presence once again of Republicans, where we go from 22-23% to 25-30 again. 30 is a great number for Republicans in Dane County. I think we can get to 25 this cycle. We need to invest in bodies. We need to invest in relationships and infrastructure. The left has a lot more staffers than we do. They have a lot more staffers. They have more money, and we're working to turn up our operation, to use the permanent infrastructure we have so that we have relationships in all of the bedroom communities. And we can mobilize the Wanakee moms. We can mobilize the Sun Prairie moms. Sun Prairie is a national progressive hotspot. And I actually pay taxes into the Sun Prairie School District. I've been to some of their school board meetings. I can tell you there are a lot of angry people out there that feel like they don't have a voice. Nobody's standing up for them with the ridiculous agenda going on in the schools and the students not feeling safe. So we are their voice. We are their voice, and we're going to do a better job of making sure that people know who the Republican Party of Dane County is and they join our ranks.
We'll be right back after this. Before we go, just a quick reminder, to find out what you will vote for next week, you can go to myvote.wi.gov and click on the What's on My Ballot tab. While there, you can also check your polling location and find contact information for your local clerk. On Election Day, polls will open at 7 in the morning and remain open until 8 at night. Remember that as long as you are in line by 8, you can still vote. And be sure to bring your ID. Next week, we'll have full election coverage both on air and online at channel3000.com. Thanks for watching. I'm Will Keneally. Have a great rest of your weekend.
This has been For the Record.